Good afternoon. On today's Angry Bulletin, it is commonly believed, especially by UFO skeptics, that weather balloons or other types of balloons, especially mylar balloons, are oftentimes the cause for various UFO sightings. Indeed, virtually all UFO sightings can be attributed to objects like this, they say. That is, if they are not attributed to fakes or hoaxes or people who have just had a bit too much to drink. However, did you know that there is a very well documented and very well substantiated case of weather balloon operators having come into close contact with a UFO while they were carrying out their operations? And to this day, even though many years have passed, this case has never been solved. All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin. As you just saw there, weather balloons and high-altitude aircraft occasionally have close encounters, and those encounters are brief, to say the least. To be honest, I don't see how the pilots of airliners or any other aircraft traveling at high velocity who claim that UAPs pace them, follow them, match their speed, that sort of thing, could ever mistake a weather balloon for something like that. As you can see, the encounters are very, very brief. I would be surprised if a pilot could actually spot a weather balloon during these close encounters, especially when you consider how difficult it was to see that aircraft if it wasn't for the contrails that it was leaving behind it. All of that having been said, though, it is commonly believed that balloons, of course making up a great percentage of airborne clutter, are responsible for the vast majority of aerial UAP sightings. However, there is a very well documented case, as I mentioned during the introduction, where the operators of these types of balloons actually spotted a UFO, and this created quite a sensation at the time. But it was a very long time ago, and like so many of these cases that took place in the late 40s and 50s, they have been completely forgotten. But fortunately, the records have not. And while browsing the CIA reading room of all things, I came across this interesting case, which was recorded by a J. Gordon Veith, who wrote a book called 200 Miles Up, The Conquest of the Upper Air. Had nothing to do actually with UFOs, but it did have something to do with this particular case that took place in 1949, April 24th, 1949 to be precise, and I'm going to quote extensively from this book. Quote, "On that date, a balloon crew was at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, together with personnel from the U.S. Navy Special Devices Center for a special skyhook flight to be undertaken for that Office of Naval Research Activity." Skyhook, by the way, was a program that used weather balloons to actually conduct a lot of military reconnaissance, and it is believed that many of the UFO sightings that happened in the 40s and 50s can be attributed to that program, and that's what makes this particular case so fascinating. The author was present as Navy representative in charge of the ground handling and balloon phases of the operation. As part of this particular project, a balloon launching site had been established 3 miles north of Aire, New Mexico. Charles B. Moore Jr., an aerologist, graduate engineer, and balloonist, and 4 enlisted personnel from the Navy unit White Sands Proving Ground had set up facilities there to observe and record local weather data preparatory to the Special Devices Center skyhook operation. Instrumentation on hand consisted of a stopwatch and what's called a theodolite, and I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing that, but it is a telescope used to track these objects, these balloons. It's a 25-power telescope, by the way, mounted as to provide readings of vertical elevation and horizontal azimuth bearings, meaning they had an instrument that was very well suited to read the altitude and general disposition of any object that they were looking at. At 10:20 a.m. on April 24th, this group of 5 released a small 350-gram weather balloon for observation of upper wind velocities and directions. The balloon was followed by more with the telescope until immediately after the 10:30 reading, when he relinquished the tracking instrument to look up to find the balloon with the naked eye. Searching the sky for the balloon, he thought he'd found it when he saw a whitish spherical object right along the direction that the telescope was pointed, about 45 degrees elevation, 210 degrees azimuth. The object was moving east at a rate of 5 degrees of azimuth change per second. When the difference in angle between the telescope and the supposed balloon became apparent, Moore took over the theodolite, as I'm going to keep mispronouncing that probably, and found the true balloon still there, whereupon he immediately abandoned it and picked up the unidentified object as it came out of the sun. At the time, the sun was at a computed bearing of 60 degrees elevation and 127 degrees azimuth. The object was moving too fast to be kept in the scope through cranking the theodolite around. One of the men, therefore, had to point the telescope while Moore observed the object through it. The object was an ellipsoid, about 2.5 times as long as it was wide. It had a length of about 0.02 degrees subtended angle. Now, they calculate the size of it later on, we'll get to that, and was gleaming white in color. It did not have metallic or a reflected shine. Toward the underside, near the tail, the gleaming white became a light yellow. The object, readily visible to the naked eye and seen by all of the members of the group, filled the field of the telescope's 25-power viewfinder. Its rapid movement, unfortunately, prevented Moore from attaining a hard or clear focus, and so no good detail was observable. The azimuth angle decreased as the object continued on a north heading. Becoming smaller in size, it moved to an azimuth reading of 20 degrees to 25 degrees, at which point the azimuth held constant. Coincidentally, with this constant azimuth, the elevation angle suddenly increased from 25 degrees minimum to 29 degrees, at which point the object was lost to sight. It disappeared in a sharp climb after having been visible to Moore and his group for about 60 seconds. 15 minutes after the object had disappeared, Moore sent up another weather balloon to check wind values. This balloon burst after an 88-minute flight to 93,000 feet and traveled only 13 miles in a southerly direction during that time. This was positive proof that the object could not have been a balloon moving at such angular speed below 90,000 feet. The object was seen under conditions of a cloudless sky and no haze. It left no vapor trail or exhaust. It was observed from an isolated mud flat in the New Mexico desert where there was extreme quiet. No noise of any kind was heard in connection with the sighting, and there were no cars, airplanes, or other noises nearby which might have blotted out sound coming from the object. As the day progressed and airplanes flew over and near the balloon launching site, Moore's group was able to identify them by appearance and engine noise. They saw nothing again that day which bore any resemblance to the white, elliptical, unidentified object. Moore's sighting was an extremely fortunate one in that tracking instrumentation was set up in a weather balloon airborne at the time. It represents one of the best substantiated and authentic unidentified object sightings on record. The foregoing discussion of flying saucers did not represent any desire by the author to become involved in this controversial subject. The saucers have been mentioned because there has been a number of cases in close relationship relationship between reported sightings and the flight trajectories of skyhook balloons. The description of Moore's instrumented sighting of an unidentified object has been included because it is authentic. Details have not been previously published, and it occurred during a skyhook operation. The author, and indeed Moore himself, make no claim that the unidentified object was a flying saucer. Now, another sighting by the same company, which by the way is General Mills Incorporated, no, not the cereal guys, maybe it is, but they were also associated with lots of extremely advanced technology and studies related to it. But the sighting was in the vicinity of White Sands, New Mexico, and was reported by Captain Edward Ruppelt, former chief of the Air Force Project Blue Book UFO investigation. 2 General Mills employees and 4 others at Artesia, New Mexico, were watching a skyhook balloon on January 16, 1951, less than 2 years later. And suddenly, they noticed 2 tiny specks on the horizon moving towards them. The objects shot past their weather balloon and tipped on edge, revealing their disc shape. Then they circled the balloon once and flew off towards the horizon. In comparison with the known size of the balloon, the discs were estimated to be about 60 feet in diameter. And incidentally, if we're talking about the original sighting, the object, according to rough estimations by Moore and his colleagues, was about 56 miles above the Earth, 100 feet long, and was traveling at 7 miles per second. That is unquestionably hypersonic speed. Now, we'll deal with how that could be possible in our atmosphere in just a moment, but also I'd like to go ahead and quote a couple of paragraphs out of a book written by the former head of Project Blue Book, who also investigated what was going on at General Mills. And this is what he had to say, quote, "The Aeronautical Division of General Mills Incorporated of Wheaties and Betty Crocker fame," okay, so it was that General Mills after all, "had launched and tracked every skyhook balloon that had been launched prior to mid-1952. They knew what their balloons looked like under all lighting conditions, and they also knew meteorology, aerodynamics, astronomy, and they knew UFOs. I talked to these people for the better part of a full day, and every time I tried to infer that there might be some natural explanation for the UFOs, I just about found myself in a fresh snowdrift." I think this was in Minnesota, by the way. What made these people so sure that UFOs existed? In the first place, they had seen many of them. One man told me that one tracking crew had seen so many that the sight of a UFO no longer even especially interested them, and the things that they saw couldn't be explained. After my visit to General Mills Incorporated, I couldn't help remembering a magazine article I'd read about a year before. It said that there was not a single reliable UFO report that couldn't be attributed to a skyhook balloon. But let's go back to this immense speed that this object was supposedly traveling at, 25,200 miles an hour or 40,555 kilometers an hour. That's absolutely insane and should have produced a meteor-like fireball in the sky, because the object, although quite high up, was still traveling through our atmosphere, and yet it didn't. That is absolutely impossible, isn't it? Isn't it? Well, we need to skip ahead in time from 1949 to a type of propulsion that I've talked about on this channel before. This propulsion system, called electrohydrodynamic propulsion, can also work in the air, although it ideally works in the water, and it works by charging the atmosphere in front of the craft, which functions best, by the way, if it's saucer-shaped, and then charging whatever's behind the craft at the same time. This can be done through a variety of different methods. You can go ahead and check out my video on the topic if you'd like to learn more about it, but the idea is once the air is charged in front of the spacecraft, it can then use a powerful electromagnetic field to pull the airflow around the spacecraft, providing lift. And since it is using the air in such an efficient manner and it flows cleanly around the spacecraft without creating much in the way of bow shock, it will create a glowing effect around the spacecraft because of all the ionization. By the way, this was a very shiny white color, but not metallic as was described, but it doesn't create any bow shock to speak of. That being the case, then, it wouldn't create the fireball because it wouldn't be cutting through the atmosphere in the same way that a meteor does. Now, once again, this is completely theoretical, but at the same time, it could definitely be done, and this fits with the way that many UFOs supposedly travel when they're being observed. The ability to travel at extremely high velocities without a sonic boom, without having any sort of real effect on the atmosphere around them, because the object is moving with the atmosphere rather than against it. And by the way, the same principle could even work in outer space as long as a spacecraft were to manipulate the magnetic fields of planets, stars, or anything else, and use the corresponding magnetic field generated by the spacecraft in order to manipulate these powerful magnetic fields and provide thrust. So this is something, by the way, that I have talked about a couple of times in my UFO propulsion videos, again linked at the end of this video, but in my opinion a very good explanation for what was observed. And it's also understandable that scientists at that time would have rejected this explanation or rejected the description of the craft in question simply because its motion would be impossible based on the physics that they understood back in 1949. All of that having been said, this is very compelling evidence put forward by people who really know their craft, especially when it comes to balloons, and yet nobody talks about it anymore. It's barely even referenced in the media. In fact, the only reason I found it was by plowing through the CIA reading room, again, which I have linked in the description. So I will continue bringing you more details on all of this. Make sure to share these videos with people you know, because these accounts are not that well known anymore. They're being buried in the annals of time, and that is very unfortunate because even though this incident took place over 70 years ago, until it is solved, we need to continue investigating events like these until they are. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, please check the description for various ways to support this content. And as always, stay angry about space.